Welcome to a Christmassy edition of Beyond the Sermon. We're here in the studio where we have decked it out for Christmas things. If you catch it on the B-cam, we got a nice little Easter egg over my shoulder for you to enjoy. Ho, ho, ho-tho. Merry Christmas. I'm Matt Hotho, I guess, actually, as you would know by the ho, ho, ho-tho that's on the wall behind me. And with me, I've got...
Magrinch de Vega, senior pastor of the church.
There we go. So you can see we're in a mood today. It's been a good day. But Magrey, or Magrinch, we'll go with Magrey though. We're here today to talk about your book, The Christmas Letters, which is the basis for our new sermon series that we're doing called The Christmas Letters. And if you just watched the sermon, we talked about chapter 1, which had to do with what, Magrey? Tell me what's in chapter 1.
It's about the letter to the Romans. And the essential idea behind the book is that the letters that Paul and others wrote were the earliest pieces of New Testament literature. They were written, in some cases, decades before the Gospels, which means that what we're reading here in the letters was written even before we could read stories about Mary and Joseph and the shepherds and the wise men. So we get the earliest glimpse into what the early church began to think about who Jesus was, including the incarnation and his divinity and his humanity. So in the sermon, I talk about us being literary archaeologists, where we're digging back earlier and earlier and earlier to get the first glimpse into what the church started to believe about who Jesus was, which gives us a bit of an interesting take on the Christmas message.
That's kind of fun when you do that. In seminary, we called that closing the hermeneutical gap, where you would basically try and just get as close as you could to the actual event. And we know we can't get there.
Right.
But that understanding that you get of this is how Christians were first thinking about what it meant for Jesus to be Jesus, right? To be God incarnate, right? Paul doesn't really talk about Jesus' birth a whole lot. There's no birth narrative in Paul's letters, right? There's no birth narrative in the earliest gospel even, right? The idea of Jesus' birth and shepherds and angels and wise men, that seems like a later addition to the Jesus story. That doesn't mean it wasn't true. It didn't happen. But in the proclamation of who Jesus was, the main stuff, right, was what Paul said of, I preach Christ crucified. Right. For Paul, that was the biggest thing. And what you're getting at in Romans, though, is Paul's still saying something to this community that has some flavor of the Christmas message to it.
Absolutely. In fact, in the sermon, I talk about two essential linchpins that are central to Romans, but also the Christmas message, which is a reminder that God's been working in our past, which Paul weaves in through the letters by talking about the prophets, especially Isaiah, and that God is at work in our present. As I say in the sermon, as a descendant of David, that means he was a real person, and God actually works in the context of human history, like in real time. So that's a very helpful thing for you to hear if God were to write a Christmas letter to you, that God has always been working in your past and God is currently working in your present. That's a pretty helpful thing.
Have you ever done that exercise where you write yourself a letter at the end of the year you seal it up and you try not to lose it? And then you read it at the end of the year?
Yes, that's a great practice. In fact, I think Justin had us do this as a staff a couple of years ago, where at the beginning of the year, in January, he had us do that. He set up a template or a rubric for us to write to ourselves in the future, and then he gathered all the letters. Many of us had forgotten that we even written those letters, and then by the end of the year, we had opened the letter to hear from our past selves. And so we could relive in many ways what we were going through in the past. I'd liken it to growth rings on a tree. Mm-hmm. So when you take a look at what you have written to yourself or to others in the past year or years before, you can actually step back in time into what you were experiencing, how you were thinking about things, and you can relive a past in a way that is dynamically present in the moment right now. One time I came across a letter that I had written, just something I'd written about 25 years ago. It was in a file that it got stuck in a box that got moved around from house to house. And I was going through old stuff and I found this thing about how I had felt God working in my life on New Year's Eve, like in the 90s. And as I was reading through that, I could remember what I was going through. But more importantly, I could think about how I've matured and how I've stayed the same in the last 25 years. And so to have a chance to look at Christianity in its infancy gives us an appreciation of all that the church went through to come up with the faith that has been passed down to us over the years.
Yeah. So in your sermon this week, you also pivot us with a new opening prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you kind of teased that out last week, right?
Right.
That you're replacing the prayer of, oh God, open our eyes to empathy, curiosity, and humility, that we might be generous and compassionate towards others and ourselves. That's what 3 years of hearing that prayer does to you.
Yeah. Good job.
Hey, no worries.
Good
That's
job.
not the only thing I hear playing in my head
Yeah,
from you
yeah,
all the
yeah.
time, but it's okay. We won't go there.
Oh, that's a different episode.
That's a different episode. We can go to that.
Yeah.
No, it's fun just getting to edit your videos, because I get to hear all your content in my head sometimes. Anyways, that prayer, but you changed it to a new prayer that I would love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about what was behind that one, which I don't have memorized yet.
Yeah, the new prayer is, God, open our hearts to courage, humility, and integrity, that we might be faithful to this and every moment. And this was something that had been building up within me, just pondering those three qualities really over the past summer. Humility is still a holdover from that earlier prayer, and it still feels like humility needs to be a value that we hold within ourselves. It still exemplifies Philippians 2. It's still in short supply today because our default mode is not to be humble, but to think of ourselves as independent and in some ways better than other people. Humility is a really important quality. But it's courage and integrity that really started to weave itself into my life personally, as I've had to help myself and the church and the denomination navigate through a lot of change and unsettledness, particularly through, as United Methodists, a season of disaffiliation, and then helping the denomination move toward a more inclusive vision of what God is calling us to be. And then on many personal fronts and in many relationships, the idea of both courage and integrity really are in tandem. Because it's one thing to just be courageous, to do bold and risky things and to make sacrifices and to try to do great things. But if it's not done with integrity, then that completely undermines the change that God is calling us to be. On the other hand, just integrity without courage is building up oneself to be a person of great character and being the best person that you can be. But if it doesn't have lasting effective change through courageous acts of faithfulness, then that again does not amount to anything. And if both of those things are not done with humility, then it's all done out of selfish ambition.
Yeah, there's something triune about these prayers,
Really
right?
true,
Where
yeah.
there's very much a balance there. And you need all three of them. And if one's missing or one's overemphasized in the detriment to the others, it's an unbalanced life.
And the way I close that prayer is also important, because the first prayer ended with that we might be generous and compassionate toward others and ourselves. This one feels like a much more relevant but broader idea of being that we might be faithful to this and every moment. It's a very Wesleyan idea that we need to pay attention to every moment. It's not just doing one great thing that will set us on a trajectory towards future faithfulness. John Wesley would call us to being faithful to every moment. It required a conscious, constant attentiveness to what God is calling us in every single moment. And so that part really has resonated with me as I've developed this prayer, that it's one thing to be faithful to a moment. I'd like to think that there are moments where I'm faithful to whatever the task is. But we're called to something even tougher, which is being faithful to every moment, especially when things are going well. That can be a temptation for things to slide back. And when things are going poorly, that can be a temptation to slide back. So to be faithful to this and every moment is as much a challenge as anything else in that prayer.
Yeah, and I think as we go through this series, maybe you, the listening audience, can be listening for those moments where you might be called to be faithful. Or if you're reflecting back on the last year, moments that you were faithful, moments that you weren't. I know in Paul's letters, you're going to hear things where Paul says to the community, do this because it's what Christ did. Have in you the mind of Christ Jesus. Be faithful in spite of persecutions. There's all this encouragement to stay faithful, to keep running the race. I think that might be Hebrews, not Paul. Same idea though, to persevere in what you're doing in the life of faith. But to do it with that triune understanding of, remind me because I haven't baked it in yet.
Courage, humility, and integrity.
I had the acronym in my head of Chicago, CHI. That's how I was going to remember it.
Yeah.
That's the abbreviation for Chicago. So courage,
CHI.
humility,
good.
and integrity.
Good.
That's why I'm going to lock that one in.
That's good. That will remind me to not do integrity, courage, and humility, because that's like an itch.
That would be like an itch or an ick.
We could do this all day.
Oh boy. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. We will see you next time for Beyond the Sermon.
Humility, integrity, courage would be ick.
Yeah, that's gross.